The old St. Mercy Hospital stood abandoned on the outskirts of town, a decaying monument to a forgotten past. Its once white walls were now stained with graffiti and mold, and its windows, shattered and broken, stared out like empty eye sockets. Legend had it that the hospital was cursed, that the spirits of the patients who had died within its walls still lingered, trapped in a perpetual state of torment. One stormy night, a group of friends, driven by curiosity and a desire for thrills, decided to explore the haunted hospital. There was Emily, a fearless leader with a penchant for the supernatural; Mark, her skeptical but loyal boyfriend; Lisa, the timid but adventurous friend; and Jason, the prankster who loved to scare his friends. Armed with flashlights and a video camera, they made their way to the hospital. As they crossed the threshold, a chill ran down their spines. The air inside was thick and heavy, as if the building itself were alive, watching them, waiting. "Welcome to St. Mercy," Emily whispered, her voice echoing eerily through the empty halls. The group moved deeper into the hospital, their footsteps echoing on the cracked linoleum floors. The walls were lined with peeling paint and faded medical posters, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. As they turned a corner, they came upon the reception area, where a dusty desk stood untouched for years. "Check this out," Jason said, pointing to a patient logbook left open on the desk. "Last entry was 30 years ago. Why did they abandon this place?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Rumors say it was because of a series of unexplained deaths," Emily replied, scanning the room with her flashlight. "Patients and staff started dying in gruesome ways. The hospital shut down, and no one ever figured out why." As they continued their exploration, they stumbled upon the old surgical ward. Rusty surgical instruments lay scattered on blood-stained tables, and the walls were covered in dark, crusted splatters. The sight made their stomachs churn, but they pressed on, determined to uncover the secrets of the hospital. In one of the operating rooms, they found a series of strange symbols etched into the floor. Emily, fascinated by the occult, knelt down to examine them more closely. "These are ancient runes," she said. "They're used in rituals to summon or trap spirits." "Maybe this place really is haunted," Mark muttered, feeling a growing unease. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and their breath became visible in the cold air. A faint whisper echoed through the room, and the lights of their flashlights flickered. Lisa let out a scream as she felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. "Did you hear that?" Jason asked, his bravado fading. "We should get out of here." But Emily was determined. "No, we need to find out what's causing this. We need to go to the basement. That's where they kept the worst cases." Reluctantly, the group made their way down to the basement. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the darkness seemed to swallow their light. As they reached the bottom, they were greeted by a long, narrow hallway lined with metal doors. Each door had a small window, through which they could see padded cells and rusty restraints. "This is where they kept the mentally ill patients," Emily said. "Some say they were experimented on." A sudden noise made them jump. It sounded like something was dragging along the floor. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was right in front of them. From the shadows emerged a figure, a gaunt, skeletal man in a hospital gown, his eyes hollow and empty. He reached out towards them, his fingers long and bony. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raspy and filled with pain. "They won't let me leave." Panic set in as the friends realized they were not alone. They turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The walls began to close in, and the air grew thicker, suffocating. Whispers filled the air, voices of the damned, crying out for release. Jason, in his desperation, pushed open one of the metal doors and stumbled into the cell. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The others watched in horror as he pounded on the window, his screams muffled by the thick glass. Blood began to seep from the walls, pooling around his feet. "Jason!" Lisa screamed, but it was too late. The blood rose higher, engulfing him, until all that remained was a dark, silent cell. Terror gripped them as they realized there was no escape. The hospital had claimed another victim, and it wasn't finished yet. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out for them. Emily, Mark, and Lisa huddled together, their fear palpable. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice shaking. "This place is cursed." Emily nodded, her bravado gone. "We need to find the source of this evil and destroy it." But as they turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut, trapping them in the darkness. The air grew colder, and the whispers became screams. The friends could feel their sanity slipping away, their minds breaking under the weight of the horror they had uncovered. St. Mercy Hospital had them now, and it would not let them go. The spirits of the damned closed in, their eyes filled with an eternal, insatiable hunger. The hospital would feed on their fear, their pain, their souls, and they would join the ranks of the lost, forever trapped in the endless nightmare of the hospital's dark past. And so, the story of St. Mercy Hospital continued, a place where the walls echoed with the cries of the damned, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and despair. The hospital was alive, and it hungered for more. The trio stood paralyzed, their eyes darting around the dimly lit basement. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to crush their spirits, and every breath felt labored. Emily, determined to find a way out, took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "We have to stay together," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of wails and whispers. "There's got to be a way out." Mark, gripping Emily's hand tightly, nodded. "Maybe we can find something in the records room," he suggested, recalling the layout of the hospital from old blueprints they had seen online. "It's supposed to be down here somewhere." They moved cautiously, their flashlights flickering as if the very batteries were being drained by the malevolent energy surrounding them. Every creak of the floorboards and distant clatter set their nerves on edge. Lisa lagged behind, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows seemed to reach out for her, and she could feel cold fingers brushing against her skin. She whimpered, but Emily grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "Stay close," Emily urged. "Don't look back." They finally reached the records room, a heavy steel door standing slightly ajar. Mark pushed it open with a groan, and they stepped inside, the smell of mildew and decaying paper assaulting their senses. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents spilled across the floor in disarray. Emily rummaged through the papers frantically. "There has to be something here, something that explains what happened." Mark joined her, flipping through dusty files. "Look for anything about rituals, experiments, anything that might explain those symbols we saw." As they searched, Lisa's gaze was drawn to a photograph on the wall. It was a black and white picture of the hospital staff, taken decades ago. Her eyes widened as she recognized one of the faces, the gaunt, skeletal man they had seen in the hallway. "Guys," she whispered, her voice trembling, "look at this." Emily and Mark turned to see what she was pointing at. The man's hollow eyes seemed to bore into them from the photograph. Emily's heart raced as she read the caption beneath the picture. "Dr. Harold Stevenson, Chief of Surgery." Dr. Stevenson was the head doctor here, Emily said, her voice shaking. If anyone knew what was happening, it would have been him. "Look at this," Mark said, holding up a file. "There are notes about a series of experiments he was conducting. Something about soul transfer and immortality." Emily's eyes widened as she read the notes over Mark's shoulder. He was trying to trap souls in the hospital using ancient rituals. That's what those symbols were for. He thought he could achieve immortality by binding the souls of his patients here. Suddenly, the room grew colder and the whispers intensified. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to coalesce into a dark, writhing mass. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room, filled with rage and sorrow. "You have disturbed my work," the voice growled. "You will pay with your lives." The shadows surged forward, and the friends screamed as they were enveloped in darkness. They felt icy hands gripping their arms, pulling them down into the abyss. The air was filled with the sounds of their frantic struggles and the eerie, malevolent laughter of Dr. Stevenson. Emily, fighting against the overwhelming terror, remembered the symbols she had seen in the operating room. "We need to destroy the symbols," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's the only way to break the ritual." Mark and Lisa, understanding the urgency in her voice, struggled to free themselves from the spectral grasp. With a Herculean effort, they broke free and ran towards the operating room, the shadows nipping at their heels. As they reached the room, Emily frantically scratched at the symbols with a piece of broken glass, trying to disrupt the ritual's power. Mark and Lisa joined in, using anything they could find to deface the symbols. The hospital seemed to roar in pain as the symbols were destroyed, the walls shaking and the floor buckling beneath them. The shadows recoiled, and the whispers turned to screams of anguish. With one final, desperate effort, Emily gouged out the last symbol. The room exploded in a blinding flash of light, and the friends were thrown to the ground. When they opened their eyes, the shadows were gone, and the hospital was eerily silent. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the air felt lighter. They staggered to their feet, bruised and shaken but alive. "We did it," Mark whispered, his voice filled with relief. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "We need to get out of here now." They made their way back through the hospital, their steps hurried and fearful. As they crossed the threshold and stepped into the stormy night, they felt a sense of profound relief. The hospital loomed behind them, silent and still. But as they walked away, a faint whisper echoed through the air, barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You may have escaped, but the hospital will always hunger for more. And one day, it will call you back." The friends exchanged fearful glances, but said nothing. They knew they would never return to St. Mercy Hospital. But the memory of that night would haunt them forever, a dark reminder of the horrors they had faced and the malevolent force that still lingered within those decaying walls. The rain battered them as they ran from St. Mercy Hospital, its ominous silhouette fading into the distance. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of their car, parked far enough away that the hospital was just a dark blur against the stormy sky. They piled in, hearts pounding, and Mark fumbled with the keys before finally starting the engine. As they drove away, the tension in the car was palpable. The silence was only broken by their labored breathing and the rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers. None of them spoke. The terror they had experienced was too fresh, too raw. It wasn't until they reached Emily's house that they felt a semblance of safety. They sat in the living room, still drenched and shivering, cups of hot tea in their hands. The warmth and normalcy of the room contrasted sharply with the horrors they had just escaped. "We need to tell someone," Lisa finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The police or a priest. Someone who can deal with whatever that was." Emily nodded. "We will. But right now, we need to rest and gather our thoughts. We can't let this consume us." The following days were a blur of restless sleep and haunting nightmares. Each of them was plagued by visions of the hospital, of the gaunt man and the blood-stained walls. Emily researched tirelessly, contacting experts in the occult and paranormal investigators. She even spoke to a local historian who confirmed the dark history of St. Mercy Hospital. Mark, despite his initial skepticism, threw himself into understanding the rituals and symbols they had encountered. He discovered that while they had disrupted the ritual, the hospital's malevolent force wasn't entirely banished. It was weakened but still present, lying in wait for the right moment to strike again. Lisa, meanwhile, sought comfort in her family and friends. She was the most affected, the trauma manifesting in panic attacks and a pervasive sense of dread. She started therapy, hoping to find a way to cope with the lingering fear. A month passed before they felt ready to confront the authorities. They met with the local police chief, an old friend of Emily's family, and recounted their harrowing experience. While skeptical, the chief promised to investigate and keep the hospital off limits to the public. But Emily knew it wasn't enough. She contacted a renowned exorcist, Father O'Malley, and convinced him to perform a cleansing ritual. Together with Mark, they returned to St. Mercy Hospital, determined to finish what they had started. The exorcism was a grueling process. Father O'Malley moved through the hospital, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water. Emily and Mark followed, carrying salt and sage, marking the walls and doorways. The air grew thick with tension, and several times they felt the oppressive presence trying to push them out. In the basement, where the ritual had its strongest hold, Father O'Malley set up an altar. He lit candles and incense, reciting powerful incantations to banish the evil. The building seemed to groan in protest, and shadows flickered menacingly at the edges of their vision. As the exorcism reached its climax, a deafening roar filled the hospital. The ground shook, and for a moment, Emily feared they would be buried alive. But with one final, fervent prayer, Father O'Malley thrust his crucifix into the center of the room. A blinding light exploded outward, and the oppressive force shattered, dissipating into the air. Silence followed, profound and absolute. The hospital, now eerily quiet, seemed to lose its malevolent aura. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. The exorcism had worked, the evil was banished, and the spirits trapped within were finally at peace. Exhausted but relieved, Emily and Mark helped Father O'Malley pack up. They left the hospital as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight casting a warm glow over the once dark building. It looked almost peaceful now, like any other abandoned structure. Back in town, they regrouped with Lisa, who had been too traumatized to return to the hospital. When they told her what had happened, she broke down in tears, a mix of relief and lingering fear. But she knew, deep down, that they had done the right thing. St. Mercy Hospital would no longer be a place of torment and despair. Its dark past had been confronted, its evil exorcised. The friends vowed to never speak of it again, to move on with their lives and leave the horrors behind. But as they parted ways, each carried a piece of that night with them, a reminder of the darkness that exists in the world and the courage it takes to face it. And while St. Mercy Hospital stood empty and silent, its walls would forever hold the memory of the souls who had suffered within. For now, the hunger was gone, but they knew they would never forget the night they faced the darkness and survived. The hospital had been exorcised, but the scars it left behind would remain forever.